You're saying something that's actually factually inaccurate,
Right.
according to the narrative. Now, let's be real clear. I don't necessarily think they know what's going on yet. There's a lot of weird shit going on with this.
The video opens by stressing how quickly a private loss turned into a public spectacle. Within hours, the timing looked unusually aligned. Charlie Kirk's death stopped being a singular event and became a digital battleground where emotion outran evidence. The first wave was familiar: condolences, clips of his speeches, tributes that tried to freeze time. But then the current shifted. Comment threads began to ask not only what happened, but who might be shaping the story. The clip frames this as the modern cycle. A sparse official statement lands, platforms fill in the gaps, and the vacuum rewards the most dramatic theories. Before details could settle, accusations multiplied, and the case migrated from investigators' desks to timelines and live streams. In that churn, the piece argues, a caricature threatened to replace the person. It quotes sentiments about not letting a meme version of Charlie, the campus debater, the soundbite machine, flatten the complexity of the human being. Yet the very machinery that claimed to defend his legacy, viral edits, stitched reaction videos, open-source sleuthing, also turned his final hours into content. The narration lingers on that contradiction. Grief demands quiet. Algorithms demand motion. As views climbed, so did certainty. Often built on fragments, misheard quotes, and zoomed-in screenshots. The segment also notes how language hardened in real time. Casual what-ifs became declarative captions. An eyebrow-raising coincidence hardened into pattern. The host doesn't present this as proof of a cover-up, rather as proof of how online momentum can feel like truth. The moral, delivered in a sober tone, is procedural. Early narratives are almost always wrong in some way. Without sourcing, context, and unglamorous documentation, door logs, camera uptime, verified timelines, emotion becomes the evidentiary standard. And once a theory accrues enough likes, the burden of proof flips. Official updates are treated as spin, while speculative threads are treated as discovery. The video promises to sift that noise rather than amplify it, but it also admits the paradox. Even careful critique can add oxygen. So the narrator lays a ground rule for what follows. Treat claims as claims, distinguish allegation from record, and keep a running ledger of what's verified, what's inferred, and what's simply rumor. Only then, it argues, can anyone tell the difference between a story that honors a life and a story that feeds a feed. The clip's next turn is abrupt. Attention swivels from the incident to the person closest to it, Erica. The narrator doesn't claim to know her heart. Instead, it tracks how the internet decided it did. In the hours after the news broke, her name migrated to the trending column, not for a eulogy, but for a post that struck many as strangely composed. Where audiences expected the raw, staccato language of shock, they saw something measured. Photos arranged, words chosen, a cadence that read to some like a statement rather than a cry. And then there was the line that detonated discourse. You don't know the fire you've lit in this wife. The video doesn't declare it sinister. It documents the reaction. Admirers read resolve. Skeptics read performance. Either way, the caption became the fuse. From there, the narrator rehearses a familiar investigative maxim. Spouses are always examined first in suspicious deaths before warning how easily a procedural truism morphs into a social media verdict. Screens filled with dueling interpretations. Was she projecting strength or signaling something else? The piece notes how grief is notoriously nonconforming. Some freeze, some organize, some speak in riddles because standard language breaks. Yet in a climate already primed by rumor, her composure fed a narrative loop. If it looks scripted, maybe it is. That's not evidence. It's optics weaponized by uncertainty. Candace Owens enters here as a force multiplier. She doesn't accuse in the legal sense. She reframes the camera. Look at the front row. is the gist. Not because proof has surfaced, the video says, but because proximity always draws suspicion. The result is an unstable cocktail. One striking caption, a widow now tasked with managing a public's expectations of how sorrow should sound, and a prominent commentator urging scrutiny when the official record is still thin. The clip emphasizes that two truths can coexist. It is reasonable to ask who had access, and it is reckless to swap access for guilt. To ground that tension, the narrator contrasts signals. Owens's unvarnished tribute, shaky voice, unedited slides, versus Erica's polished presentation, and how that contrast became a story of its own. The video stops short of endorsing either red. Instead, it keeps circling the same caution light. In a case starved of verified detail, style becomes mistaken for substance. And until process documents, not posts, fill the gaps. The fairest sentence anyone can write about a widow is the shortest one. We don't know. The segment rewinds to the auditorium and lets the scene play at normal speed. The applause thinning, the lights settling, the buzz of a campus event that should have been forgettable by morning. The narrator stresses scale first. Not a side room or a back hall, but a packed venue with cameras, ushers, and a schedule that ran like clockwork. In that context, the video argues chaos had a contour. The timeline it sketches is simple: a precise window, a known exit, and a vantage point that mattered. It doesn't claim an omniscient director. It argues the beats land too neatly to feel like an improvisation. What tips the narration from tragic to constructed is how it pairs place with pattern. The presenter points to the elements that repeat at big events: credentialed access routes, choke points, stage-left egress, and suggests whoever acted either studied those features or was fed them. That's the rhetorical hinge. Inside knowledge versus very good scouting. The piece doesn't prove either. It insists the distinction matters. If it's scouting, you expect mistakes. Wrong door, bad angle, seconds off. If it's inside info, you expect alignment. Right door, right angle, right second. The night looked aligned. The camera then moves from the room to the perimeter. The rooflines, stairwells, loading bays. Here the script leans on the audience's intuition. A roof isn't a bench. You don't wander onto one during a high-profile talk. Doors lock. Badges log. Cameras watch. If an entry was propped or a feed was down, the narrator says, those are dull facts that will live in maintenance tickets and badge audits. Publish them, and half the speculation evaporates. Keep them sealed, and the roof becomes a metaphor for the whole case. Visible, but inaccessible. Finally, the segment returns to demeanor. It quotes witnesses who, in their own retellings, say the suspect's movements looked controlled, not feral. No sprinting, no flinch. The video doesn't alchemize poise into guilt by network. It uses the observation to argue against a purely impulsive act. Calm in crisis can mean training. It can also mean nothing at all. That ambivalence is the point. The narrator refuses the neatness of certainty and asks for the paperwork that makes certainty possible. Door logs, camera uptime records, staffing sheets, a minute-by-minute of the stage run. Without those, it says, the public will do what it always does: fill in the dark with the story that best explains why the beats landed when they did. And once a crowd decides choreography existed, it's a short step to assuming a choreographer. When the narrative fastens on a suspect, it lands on a 22-year-old, Tyler Robinson. On paper, the label is tidy. One name, one motive to be determined, one chain of custody. But the clip lingers on frictions that make the lone actor frame feel too smooth. First is precision. The account presented says Tyler knew the show's cadence, the moment the program would break, the exit Kirk favored, the angles that mattered. That isn't the same as knowing a start time posted on a flyer. It reads as schedule granularity, the kind planners trade in and volunteers learn during run-throughs. The video doesn't assert a mole. It simply asks whether that level of timing can be harvested from public cues alone. Then there's poise. Multiple witness retellings, the host says, converge on a tone. Movements that were measured, not manic. No erratic sprints, no panicked dithering. Just task completion calm that, to some viewers, looked rehearsed. The narration is careful here. Composure doesn't prove training. People freeze or flow for 100 reasons. But if the official portrait is impulsive outburst, demeanor that reads procedural sits oddly beside it. That mismatch, impulse versus method, becomes a seam people keep picking. Access is the third seam. Rooftops are not public squares. They're controlled by locks, ladders, and badges. If Tyler found his way up by persistence and luck, the paper trail should be boring and clear. A propped door, a disabled magnet, a camera outage ticket. If he was waived or let through, that's a different category of problem. The video doesn't claim which. It notes that the answer is auditable and urges its release. In a case crowded with inference, the fastest solvent is infrastructure paperwork. Finally, the profile problem. Neighbors and acquaintances quoted in the segment describe someone not especially political, not plugged into activist circuits, not a known ranter. That doesn't preclude radicalization. It just means the arc from quiet to precise operator needs more than a single line in an indictment. The narrator's refrain is consistent. The more the story leans on precision, timing, vantage, composure, the more it invites the question how that precision formed. Lone actors can be meticulous. They can also be staged as such. Distinguishing the two is why investigators exist. Until they surface the dull records, access logs, timeline reconciliations, full incident maps, the public will keep reverse engineering a supply chain behind one young man's name because the shape of the night looks less like a fluke and more like a plan. Having pressed on precision, the video leans into the implication many viewers jump to next. If the act looked timed, mapped, and emotionally controlled, then Tyler Robinson must have had help. The narrator doesn't unveil a shadow cell. It diagrams the assumptions that build a lattice around a single name. Start with logistics. Rooftop access during a high-profile event implies more than bravado. Someone needs the floor plan, the set list, the egress pattern, and a window when security attention is elsewhere. None of that requires a Hollywood conspiracy. It does, however, suggest process knowledge, the kind crew members, venue staff, or tightly embedded volunteers acquire. The script stresses a key fork. Knowledge can be observed, patient casing, open rehearsals, or conveyed. Texts, whispers, a quick use stage left. Which fork you choose largely determines whether your mind writes accomplices. Then funding creeps in. The host lists expenses, transport, lodging, hardware, the kind of low-glare gear that doesn't scream for attention. It's not a princely sum, the video admits, but it does raise a procedural question. Investigators always ask, who paid and when? Bank trails are dull, but they snap speculation to or from reality. Without those ledgers, audiences fill the void with phrases like backed and handled, and the narrative ossifies around an invisible sponsor. Coordination myths blossom in ambiguity. One veteran of event security, interviewed for the segment, unnamed, summarized rather than quoted, describes how small signals can move people. An usher held at a doorway, a radio channel left busy for 30 seconds, a decoy commotion 2 corridors over. None of that proves orchestration happened. It proves how little orchestration is required to create opportunity. In that gap, internet sleuths promote patterns. A down camera here, a propped stairwell there, a lull in patrol rotation. Each single anomaly is forgivable. In slideshow form, they begin to impersonate a blueprint. The narrator pauses to draw a hard line between plausible mechanism and proven scheme. It's reasonable, they argue, to ask whether someone fed times, routes, or access tips. It's reckless to convert that reasonable question into a roster of unnamed handlers. The video's remedy never changes. Publish the tedium. Door alarms, badge audits, cash flow, phone pings. If they converge on one person, the lattice collapses. If they branch, then the public has a factual basis for talking about support. Until then, he couldn't have acted alone is not a conclusion. It's a symptom of unanswered and answerable questions. The next hinge in the video's argument is deceptively simple. Tyler Robinson wasn't dragged from a hiding place by a task force. He was turned in by his father. On its face, that's a human detail. Families buckle under a weight like this and do the agonizing, civic-minded thing. But the clip treats it as a timeline stress test. If authorities had already zeroed in on a suspect with the rooftop vantage, the routes, the hour, and the hardware, why didn't they move first? If they hadn't, why did a parent have enough certainty to make the call before the badge holders did? The narrator doesn't allege collusion. It points out the sequencing raises procedural questions investigators usually race to preempt. From there, the piece sketches two competing readings. In the benign version, detectives were triaging a chaotic scene, clearing false leads, syncing witness accounts, scrubbing noisy video, and waiting for a threshold of probable cause. In that window, the father's call simply accelerated an arrest that was coming. In the suspicious version, the call looks like a rescue line in a case that wasn't cohering, an external confirmation that allowed a wobbly narrative to firm up quickly. The truth could be somewhere in between, the host concedes, but either way the chronology matters. Show your timestamps becomes the refrain. When did officers first identify a person of interest? When did the father contact them? And how did those tracks merge? The segment then lingers on optics. A parental surrender reads differently than a perimeter takedown. It can frame the suspect as compliant, even coached. That perception, fair or not, bleeds into how the public receives later claims. Calm demeanor, precise access, inside info, because the first image after a crisis often hardens into character. The narrator's remedy is bureaucratic, not dramatic. Publish the call log, with privacy redactions. The intake memo, the time-coded alert that moved Tyler from name in notes to custody. Absent those, the gap between we were closing in and his father brought him becomes a canyon where speculation rehearses itself. Finally, the video returns to a key investigative fork it keeps highlighting: initiative versus opportunity. If authorities can map their initiative, the steps that would have led to arrest regardless of the father, confidence rises. If not, the opportunity reads as happenstance, and happenstance invites the notion of backstage arrangement. The narrator refuses to color that in. It sticks with a consistent standard. Extraordinary claims don't need theatrics to be tested. They need paperwork. Until that paperwork lands, the most honest sentence available is the one the internet hates most. We don't yet know why the handoff came first. The narrative shifts back to Erica, but not to her biography, to her posts. The clip treats her first public message like a piece of physical evidence, time-stamped, shareable, endlessly reinterpreted. What most people noticed first wasn't the photo or the filter. It was the cadence, tight sentences, a composed tone, an almost podium-ready rhythm. In isolation, that can read as strength. In the raw hours after a death, it read to many as strategy. And then there was the line that detonated the comment sections. You don't know the fire you've lit in this wife. To some, it sounded like a vow. To others, like a signal. The video refuses to translate it for her. It documents what followed. Screenshot culture stripped the words of context and turned a widow's phrasing into a Rorschach test. Here the host introduces what it calls the PR trap of grief. If you say nothing, critics label you evasive. If you speak plainly, they'll parse the adverbs. If you sound polished, because you're a public figure used to cameras, people assign motive to polish. The narration is careful. Optics are not evidence, but optics drive momentum, and momentum decides what the internet investigates next. In this case, the caption became the hinge for 1,000 side-by-sides, clips of Erica's statement matched against Candace Owens' unedited live streams. The contrast did the rest. One read as broadcast, the other as breakdown. The video notes how a style gap got moralized. Polished equals performative, shaky equals sincere. That's not a court standard, it's a platform reflex. Even so, the post triggered substantive questions the narrator doesn't wave away. If Erica intended a rallying cry, to whom was it addressed? Supporters, detractors, donors, staff? Was it a promise to pursue answers or a warning to someone unseen? Those are fair questions, the script says, but they are questions, not interim verdicts. The piece also catalogs how a single caption can seed entire subplots. Suddenly, neighbors' anecdotes, rumored marital spats, and whispers about finances began orbiting the post, as if the words themselves summoned corroboration. That's confirmation bias in real time. It's also how narratives metastasize. To puncture the spiral, the narrator proposes a boring fix. Timeline discipline. Publish the order of communications. Family notifications. Counsel retained. Statements drafted. Posts approved or not approved. Clarify whether a PR firm was involved or whether the wording was entirely her own. None of this absolves or implicates. It just drains the oxygen from conjecture by replacing vibe analysis with sequence. Until then, the video warns, every syllable Erica publishes will be read as a code. The fairest posture, it concludes, is a paradox. Extend empathy to a widow and demand documentation from institutions. Confusing the two is how captions become crime scenes and grief becomes content. This section pivots from captions to cash, because that's where the online story goes next. The clip catalogs a surge of neighborhood anecdotes, raised voices, cool silences on the driveway, weekends spent apart, woven together with unverified whispers about missing money and off-book accounts. None of that arrives as documentation. It arrives as vibe. But on the internet, the jump from "they argued" to "they argued about money" is one sentence, and from there to "money equals motive" is half a scroll. The narrator, to its credit, refuses to anoint gossip as proof. It does, however, explain why money becomes the gravitational center in cases like this. Funds concentrate power, power concentrates resentment, and resentment, fairly or not, becomes narrative fuel. The video sketches how such claims would be tested in the real world. Audits, board minutes, donor ledgers, expense approvals, 990s, ACH trails, the dull paper that turns innuendo into either evidence or air. It notes that large organizations don't move dollars invisibly. They move them through committees, policies, and software that remembers. If there were truly unaccounted funds, there should be boring, traceable discontinuities, missing invoice chains, duplicate vendor IDs, exception reports. If there weren't, rumor collapses under its own weight. That binary, produce paper or stop pointing, never trends as well as a stitched TikTok. But it's the only test that matters. Back at the kitchen table, the narration stays human. Marriages that look glossy in photos can be brittle in practice. Schedules strain, priorities split, and money, shared, earned, or promised, turns into a scoreboard. The neighbor's recollections, the video concedes, may describe nothing more sinister than two people negotiating a life lived at altitude. Yet once Erica's posts were framed as performative, every ordinary friction was retrofitted as premeditation. That's how confirmation bias works. Pick a thesis, then hoover up supporting fragments. The piece also raises a subtler point about governance versus gossip. If the organization was, as some claim, heading toward a rigorous internal audit, That's not evidence of theft. It's evidence of governance doing its job. In healthy institutions, audits are maintenance, not sirens. Turning audit into smoking gun is an internet reflex, not a finding. So the narrator proposes 2 lanes. Lane 1, empathy. Assume most marriages are complicated and that grief scrambles presentation. Lane 2, rigor. Ask for the artifacts that could substantiate or bury the money story. Engagement letters with auditors, scope memos, preliminary findings, and any board resolutions tied to controls. Until those surface, financial motive is not a conclusion. It's a conjecture dressed in spreadsheets clothing. And the fairest sentence remains the same one the video keeps returning to. Claims deserve process, not applause. When charges finally landed, 7 counts with Tyler Robinson's name at the top, the news cycle exhaled. A suspect, an indictment, a podium, the familiar choreography of closure. But the clip argues that paperwork didn't quiet the room. It split it. On one side, relief. Procedure had spoken. On the other, a new wave of skepticism led by Candace Owens, whose refrain wasn't who, but why stop here? The narrator is careful. It doesn't litigate the counts. It examines how the presentation, a lone actor narrative wrapped in tight language, collided with weeks of unanswered questions about access, timing, and composure. Owens's response becomes the section's engine. She goes live not to emote, the video notes, but to audit, reading passages aloud, comparing timestamps, and asking why an indictment that leans on spontaneity sits alongside facts that read like planning. Roof vantage, event cadence, egress knowledge. She doesn't introduce new evidence. She insists the existing story carries seams. That insistence turns procedural documents into prompts. If Tyler acted alone, where are the dull corroborators? Badge logs, door alarms, camera uptime sheets that would euthanize the inside info theory. If those exist, publish them. If they don't, why doesn't the charging document acknowledge the gaps? The narrator widens the lens to the public square. Indictments, it says, once ended arguments. Now they start parallel ones. Clips from the presser are spliced into explainers. Forum threads map floor plans. Creators with millions of followers reframe legalese into questions ordinary people can carry to dinner. In that environment, saying case closed without process exhibits reads like invitation, not conclusion. A smaller, thornier thread weaves through the section. The father's surrender. It's in the charging narrative, but not interrogated at the podium. Owens treats that omission as signal. If the handoff was pivotal, show how it intersected with police initiative. The video doesn't call it a flaw, it calls it a hole, the kind that grows because silence is sticky and speculation is loud. The close is procedural, almost dull by design. If prosecutors want the lone actor frame to travel, the narrator says, they should front-load the non-theatrical. Access audits, comms chronologies, reconciled minute-by-minute timelines. Those won't go viral, but they will undercut the need for amateurs to invent networks and motives. Until then, the section concludes, the indictment functions less like a period and more like a comma. Punctuation that pauses the story just long enough for the internet to rewrite the next clause. The final stretch of the clip steps away from suspects and captions and looks straight at us. The narrator doesn't scold. It diagrams a problem. In the modern cycle, speed outruns certainty, and the vacuum between what happened and what's proven gets filled by the most shareable version of events. That's why this story keeps splitting into mirror stories. Erica as widow or cipher. Tyler as lone actor or instrument. An audit as maintenance or motive. Each path has a logic. None has the receipts to graduate from logic to fact. So the script offers a kind of field guide. First, separate grief from governance. Extend basic empathy to people whose lives have just detonated. Reserve your sharpest questions for institutions tasked with documenting the night. Campus security, venue management, investigators. Second, distrust performance heuristics. Shaky voice isn't proof of honesty. Polished prose isn't proof of duplicity. Style is a terrible proxy for truth. Third, privilege boring artifacts over brilliant theories. Doctor logs, camera uptimes, radio transcripts, staffing rosters, badge audits, call records. If those align, speculation has nowhere to live. If they don't, that misalignment, not a viral caption, is the real story. The narrator folds Candace Owens back in here without coronation or contempt. Her value, the clip suggests, is in pressure, insisting that seams be stitched or shown. The risk is overreach, turning a seam into a storyboard before the thread has been traced. Both impulses exist in the same person. Both are common in a public that's learned to investigate from its phones. The remedy isn't silence, it's sequencing. Wait for the next tranche of documents, then test claims against them, not against our favorite narrative. The piece closes where it began, with a caution that doubles as an ethic. Do not let the internet decide what you know. It can point, it cannot prove. Proof is slow, administrative, unglamorous. It lives in memos and metadata. Until those surface, the honest posture is provisional. Hold competing hypotheses lightly, keep demand on process high, and refuse to turn people into symbols because symbols are easier to judge than humans are to understand. In that light, this case becomes more than a whodunit. It's a stress test of how we learn, what we amplify, and whether we can sit with not yet long enough for truth to catch up.